day of the virtual National Conference on Life Narratives of Experience, Memory, Identity, and Agency. Let us commence this momentous day with a silent prayer. Made narratives are memories of domestic workers that stand as testimonials of resilience and resistance in the face of oppression. These testimonials give to a plethora of questions in the mind of the reader. How do people who have grown up in a society characterized by injustice and oppression justify their role in that oppression? If they were members of the oppressed group, how do they explain their non-resistance? And if they were members of the dominant group, how do they explain their complicity in the injustice as their families benefited by the exploitation of others? For today's plenary session, we have amidst us a very distinguished personality who, rest assured, can enlighten us on the topic, the great Indian maid, life stories, and the problematic of domestic work. Dr. N.P. Ashley is a dramaturg, socio-political commentator, and translator, and a volunteer for educational work who is currently working as Professor of English at St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. He is also known for his progressive politics and experimental plays. The plays he has worked as a dramaturg have been performed at Edinburgh Theatre Festival. Areas of his scholarly interest are new historicism, performance studies, and youth culture. He was one of the consulting editors of the Pearson textbook series Lighthouse. Sir, we are privileged to have you amidst us and are eagerly waiting for your talk on the topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chitra. Thank you. Good morning. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank Professor Alna, Professor Lilikudi Abraham for being in touch with Alna, who invited me, and Professor Lilikudi Abraham, who's been sending me mails and all of that. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dilip, who I have had the privilege of working with earlier amidst us. So I'm very grateful that I've been invited to give this plenary at this very interesting conversation on life narratives organized by Kristu Jayanti College, Bangalore. It's sad that we have to do this in maintaining social distance and through the medium of technology. But in one way, we're also lucky to have these options in the middle of this pandemic. So today I thought, there's been a lot of talk about life narratives, self-writing, a lot of theory, a lot of subaltern theory, a lot of feminist work, African American work, Aboriginal writings on self-writings that have been coming up. And one of the areas which is quite interesting and very important for all of us is the domain of domestic work, domestic help, as it's now called, earlier maids, apprentices, and so on and so forth. The reason why I thought it's important to talk about this angle is that it's something that's there inside the household of many of us, middle class, or earlier feudal, later sort of upper middle class households. And how do we engage with this is a very important theoretical problem, an important ethical problem, an important political problem, according to me. I'll just begin with a small little, event in theater. One of the finest, one of the most powerful plays of all time. And students of literature would bear me out on this. Is Henrik Ibsen's Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen's play called A doll's house. Before we go on, how much time do I have? I know it's a 1 hour session, but how much time do I should I be speaking? Speaking for? I mean,
So you can speak for maybe 45 to 50 minutes, and then we can take Q&A
okay,
questions.
that's great. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I should have asked that earlier. Right. Ibsen's play, A Doll's House, famously has this woman, Nora, walking out on her husband in the last scene. And it was a play published in 1817 and became very, very important, very, very sort of, a landmark play in modernity. Its screen was such an event of importance for theater, for politics, for feminism, everything, right? The way Nora slammed the door, reverberated in the corridors of Europe, is how it's often talked about. So when there was a lot of problem uh, with this woman walking out on her husband, leaving her children there. I mean, Ibsen had to sometimes rewrite the climax, saying that she stayed on. And one of the ways in which Ibsen responded to it was by saying, I mean, she realizes she's in a doll's house, so she didn't want to be there. She walked out, right? Which we've seen in a recent Malayalam movie. That's where I'm borrowing my title from, The Great Indian Maid. So it's called The Great Indian Kitchen, Gio Baby's new film, which also has that similar kind of a walkout, right? It was obviously quite an issue, and whenever it was done anywhere, it created sort of ripples, and that kind of a storyline, even today in 2020, can be quite impactful. Is what those who don't watch Malayalam movies might have also seen the reports. A lot of reports came up about this movie across English media. So she leaves, and now Ibsen wrote a play in 1881, 2 years later, where the protagonist, the woman, doesn't leave. Her name is Mrs. Alving. It's the place called Course. She stays back. She does not go out. Her husband is a womanizer. He's quite terrible in different ways, but she didn't. She wanted that honor. She wanted to, build an orphanage in her husband. I mean, she was showing it as, okay, this is in the memory of my great husband, but what she really wanted to do was to make sure that her son did not inherit any of her husband's property. So in that, she stays on there, and towards the end, her son has got syphilis from her husband. So, he's dying. He has to be given morphine and then put to euthanasia. That's the whole terrible story. So the last scene is about the son asking for the sun, which is also a way of talking about the sun-like looking morphine pills. That's how the play ends, right? So that this is a conversation very well known in the history of theatre. But the play also has, because these are kind of middle class households, there are women in that house, women in both houses. So in Nora's case, we have no idea what the maid thinks. Maid is just around, right, helping her and things like that. She doesn't become a character even. By the course, there are two women who are servants. One's name is Joanna, who was basically molested by Mr. Alving, Captain Alving, and the child is Regina. Regina is actually presented to be this carpenter Engstrand's daughter, not as Captain Alving's, because you couldn't say that. So it's all the house is hiding too many things, house is lying on too many friends. It's a lot of terrible things that's going on around. So what actually happens is that in the second play, Regina leaves because she finds out that her father is, I mean, she's very grateful to Mrs. Alving initially, to the landlady for educating her and all of that. And she identifies with the landlady, but the landlady is actually her father's wife, right? That's when she gets to know that she actually leaves and goes away. So the second play The first play is about a middle class woman leaving. Second play is about a middle class woman staying back. But second play also has a woman leaving, right? But she's going to the city, so the leaving is not like Nora's leaving is she doesn't know where she's going, because she's not just leaving her household, but it's also a critique of the drawing room where everything was happening at that time. It was a presentable thing, so she's leaving that and she doesn't know where she's going. But in the case of uh, uh, Regina, she's going to her husband, her father, as in socially her father, instant, not biological father, is going to start a tavern, so she's going to be in charge of it. That's how it happens. Now, the point is, if you look at the story, when there is, you see Nora, the middle class woman, the lady of the house, you see Mrs. Alvin, who's the lady of the house, and you contrast one's emancipation with the other person's getting stuck in there. But by the time we come into the second one, there's a whole subtext of workers and their lives, the kind of sexual exploitation, the kind of problems that they go through there, which doesn't really become a point of discussion, right? Because these are workers, these are domestic workers. So domestic workers, the reason why I want to talk about the problematic of domestic work is that, domestic, the space of domesticity is where you hide things, you don't talk about it, you don't sort of say this is public political issue, right? Kamala Das wrote a poem called Nani, in which there was this maid who was Nani in her ancestral house. One day she committed suicide. She was seen hanging from the roof. And after 3 months, she asked her grandmother about Nani, and grandmother says, "Which Nani?" Because I mean, it's a way of hushing up the entire conversation, the entire space. You just want to, because how did she commit suicide? Why did she commit suicide? Usually, those days, like a lot of women committed suicide because they became pregnant because of the exploitation of some men there. So there's a whole lot of things which aren't really talked about. So there's a certain way in which, the hushing up happens in a structural way in the households, right? The exploitation, the discrimination, so exploitation both in terms of labor and body, that goes on. So there is a certain way in which we don't, often address this, right? So when we talk about the what Ibsen is trying to do through A Doll's House and Course in a matter of 2 years, we're not going to look at what is Regina's kind of story in this, what happens to her, right? We are making a point through these women who are sort of middle class and white and everything. So the whole domain of domestic help is an area that somehow we don't get into. The point is, it's not that sometimes you're talking about something distant, something somewhere else, that happens, right? But we are interested in the distant because it's exotic, it's very different from us. But some right beneath us, right around us, right in the other room, there is a person, there is a life, there's a story that somehow doesn't come up. For example, there was a rather funny movie, a 1990s movie called Mele Parambilan in Malayalam, which is about how a person who belongs to an agricultural family, kind of rich, wealthy agricultural family, goes to Tamil Nadu, marries a woman, brings her home as the maid, so that he doesn't get into trouble with his family for marrying her. So, and the whole movie is about how her brothers and his brothers and uncle and are all after this. This is done by Shobhana, and the role. So she's not a maid, obviously, in the character, in her body, in anything. She's a different kind of entity. But the point, interestingly, is that uh, through that it shows what is the kind of threat, what is the kind of gaze that a domestic laborer is under constantly all the time. right? So it's about a lot of violence. It's funny, it's hilarious at points, but at the same time it is about, what if she was actually a maid? Is this what a maid goes through, right? So there's a whole lot of stories that are hidden, that are a sort of violence that is actually not addressed in this whole scheme of things, which is a big problem, right? When we talk about life narratives, when we talk about self narratives, we life stories and all of that, we would like, the story of say, like a Papillon, Henry Charrier's story about how he actually escaped prisons. It's an amazing adventure story, right? Or if you look at Esteban Montijo's story of a runaway slave, or the story of an African American woman, the Greatest My Own Story by Muhammad Ali Clay. I mean, these are all either very successful people, very exotic people, very strange people. These are all stories, but the stories that are actually like right around the corner, right within our houses, aren't talked about. Because why does this happen? This happens because the space of domesticity is actually completely filled with these silences. Yeah? Patriarchy, the rule of the father, is actually built around this idea of silences, omissions, and absences, right? And so there are two ways in which we can look at this. One is, how do we look at domestic labor? The work that women do at home, women have been doing at home. Maybe there's some changes, but largely that's the thing. So how do we look at it? We look at it very, very badly, which is, we don't value it enough, because we don't think this is income. We don't think this is something that ought to be acknowledged financially, compensated financially. And if it needs to be done, you pay them very less, right? In Delhi, for about 1,500 rupees, you can get somebody to come for a month and sweep your floor, wash your dishes, 1,500 rupees. So this person would be going to 4 houses, so he'd be making about 6,000 rupees, right? So you're saying that washing the dishes, like chadu pocha, like doing the cleaning up the floor and all of that takes only this much money. That's because we have cheap labor available, right? In Delhi, there are about 2 lakh people from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh areas who are on 24 in houses. Many of them are actually underaged, and they're paid very, very pittance. I mean, it's like they are. Some of them are not even paid. What happens is they come, they get food. When they go home, they're given something, and when they're married off, a lot of expenses are taken care of by the family where she's living. That's the whole thing. It's like she's doing a job is not even part of it. So there's a certain way in which this kind of a culture has come. A certain, a normalization of violence, normalization of exploitation and discrimination. This is because domestic spaces where, the husband can beat up the wife, there can be different abuses, and which are often not talked about because the family unit is final and you can't go outside that. So there is a certain way in which, like Foucault says, all questions are finally questions of geography. Which space are you doing this in? Right. So if you look at a lot of our, Hindi cinema, or I can't say much about, some of the Tamil movies I've seen, Kannada movie, I don't know much to talk about, but definitely Malayalam movies, the domestic labor is seen as, is caricatured, is seen as slapstick, is seen as, uh, greedy. It's always caricatured in absolutely, domestic laborer is actually too fancy, too arrogant, too lazy. There's a whole set of narratives that are built around it. When you look at our jokes, and a lot of jokes are about how you make fun of domestic laborers, how you make fun vulnerability that we have imposed on them. Right. So it's a very, very important problem. So as long as there is cheap labor, this is would continue, right? Like you don't get people here. So you get from, this is the problem with, say, for example, some of the rich states in India now, because sometimes you don't want domestic laborers to come from other states. The migrant labor is not available because language is a problem, and also you have your stories, right, about cleanliness and all of that. So you don't want them to come into the house. So you get them to do other work, but coming into it, there aren't people available, right? So it is, in this sort of a situation, we often see that their price will go up because there is less people, and the whole narrative around the high pricing of women, and of domestic workers, that's a big narrative in sort of rich states. So it keeps coming up all the time, right? And so it is ethically, it's a huge problem that we are not addressing these people. That's my first submission. The second argument is we often don't see how, not just in your household work and bringing up children and all of that, not just in those kinds of things. For example, there's a 2011 Hollywood movie called The Help. If you haven't seen it, you should try watching it. It is about the help, and a woman comes back from college to home, and she asks, where is the African American maid who used to look after her? So she says, I fired her. So the girl says, how can you fire her? Because she brought me up. How could you? That's not acceptable. You can't, bringing up a person. What is its charge, right? Because that's a big narrative around on the family. So a lot of it should go to them. So why is it not work? So that's one part of it. But there's another side to this. For example, there are women. For example, if you look at Kerala again, I'm going into that because I'm more familiar with that narrative. So we say, Kerala is rich now. How did it become rich? Because of foreign remittances. Where did the foreign remittances come from? There are two reasons. Because after the land reforms in 1967, imagination became free, so people could actually leave. So in the south of Kerala, a lot of people went to America, because in 65 there was an opening for the nurses and all that. A lot of them went there. And in north of Kerala, a lot of people went to the Gulf countries, which is just getting sort of established. UAE got established in 1967, around that time, right? So a lot of countries, oil was sort of identified in the late 50s itself, but it becomes a petrodollar economy in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And at that point, a lot of people went, for example, 1974 is when Qatar Petroleum is actually launched. So around that time. Yeah. So in the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of people went. Who went? We always think, the educated went. Educated didn't go. The rich didn't go. Right, the ones who went there went in launches. Right, for example, in 1967, there is a question in the Kerala Assembly about 131 people who were caught in Kutch trying to go to Dubai in a launch. And there's a question about that. A lot of them, interestingly, are women, like, and uneducated women who braved all of this. This is not even legal initially, because there were like, it's not strictly when it's legal and all of that is it's not clear, because in the 50s and all of that, you could go to the Gulf with Indian passport. I mean, that, like, they used to use Indian rupee and all of that. So that's a different. Till the devaluation happened, it was the Britishers, using it as currency across this entire region. Anyway, so people have gone to the Gulf, and then they couldn't come back because they didn't have a passport, because you didn't need a passport before that. So that was a kind of time. But what I'm saying is that so when you talk about the first generation of migrants to the Gulf, you're talking about the uneducated, the lower caste, across religions. I'm talking about a lot of them being Dalit Muslims from the Malabar. And so there you call them ABCD. Now ABCD is like American born confused Desi, but ABCD workers are Aya, boy, cook, driver, the Ayas. A lot of Arab children were brought up by Malayali Ayas, right? The whole Gadama kind of story that you've seen, right? In that movie. So, there is it's called Gadama. So somebody goes there and works in Saudi Arabia. There's a whole bunch of people who actually created a sustainable economy that has actually sustained the richest state of India for the last 50 years. Right? But we don't actually talk about the domestic workers as those who were the pilgrim fathers or pilgrim mothers of this, right? We don't, right? We don't. I'm saying we also don't look at the quicks and drivers and the boys. We don't, of course. They're all jobs. I'm not just saying it's a gender problem. It's also a problem of invisibilized labor. Like Raymond Williams says, you see the product, but you never see the process. You invisibilize labor. You invisibilize, who makes this. So that's a huge problem, because our historical understanding, right? I often see, like I've never seen, we have salutations to people who were freedom fighters, Renaissance leaders, but why are we not talking about these people who are actually, adventurers, who braved everything? They didn't know the language. They had no idea what they were doing, right? When they established a full-on economy, right? And that's not, and second, by 80s other people started going. By 90s, it became a different kind of migration. Now you don't see so many migrant laborers there, but who went and established that connection. What got us started is the ABCD workers. And where are their stories, right? Where are the stories of those who went in launch, right? So there is a problem, because it's not just an ethical problem. It's a huge blind spot. It's a black hole in our understanding of history, because it becomes very partial. Because you don't want to look at this domain, right? Oh, that happened, right? It is by the way. But what is important? What is important is the political debate. What's important is the cultural activism. What's important is this this kind of exceptionism. But what sustains it? What makes it possible? That's a very important question, right? So again, just like the field of domesticity is kept aside, and that creates, because we are all part of domestic spaces, so put together that creates some kind of an entity. You have actually invisibilized exploitation, discrimination, and created those kinds of absences, and those absences are actually working their way into our historiography, our writing of history. That's another huge kind of problem, right? So, and the reason, the problem with not getting these stories is that we often don't understand how this kind of thinking happens. It's always a charity thing. It's always like, oh, it is, poor things. They're suffering. They're struggling. They're people who are in a very bad condition. So we feel bad for them. We talk about this, but what we don't understand is that there is another narrative that comes from the other side, which we're not looking at, because we don't have this documentation, right? Nietzsche famously said that a master thinks he's giving job to the slave by giving the job. So he's doing a good thing in itself. The slave should be, grateful. Is the narrative that master has for the slave, for the whole world. The slave, we think things. Oh, we assume things that I am, I should be very grateful to these people who are giving me a job. But that's not how they think. They have a different story. Their story is that my job, my work, my labor, my hard work is actually sustaining him. That's what is giving him this. But he's a fallen person, right? He's a bad person. I am a considerate person. So I am allowing this to happen because, maybe a silly person, sick people. So, and it's actually not, we don't often think there is a narrative like that, There is a master's narrative, there's a slave narrative. It will continue, it'll give you a certain kind of status quo. I'm not saying it will change the social order, it won't. But the social order needs two complementing stories to work. One is the master's story of benevolence, and the slave story of opposing him. Actually, we always tell stories to us about ourselves, which are often lies, but we do that, right? So the story that the servant, a maid, a domestic help is actually telling herself about the mistress, the lady, the landlord, is a very different story. We don't listen to it, right? Which is why we often don't understand there are these stories. I'll tell you, John Burnett, remarkable historian, a labor historian. He has two books called Destiny Obscure and Toil. Destiny Obscure is a famous book. It was one. Anyway, so Burnett actually studied the work of, he asked for write-ups from domestic servants, right? Anything, diary entries, their some experience. So he just wanted to collect them and put them together. Brilliant books. He came up with them. And when you read that, you understand that a lot of maids thought their landladies were not clean. They had no sense of hygiene. They had no sense of self-worth. They were lazy. They were stupid. Right? Now, that's not a story that we sort of often think about, right? So we think, the maybe the domestic servant would think of the woman as a kind, benevolent kind of person, or a brutal kind of person. But to think that this person is not clean, doesn't have hygiene, very, she's always curbing, she's always saying this, and it's very sophisticated thinking, right? And that's something we don't really work with. We don't really understand that these are also ways of actually understanding the world, right? How do they think? We don't ask that because we don't have the archive. We have not put it together. So we just think of it, it's very atomized, right? We don't go around collecting these stories. We don't understand the language. We don't understand the life values. We don't understand the questions. Because, once collectivization happens, there'll be a political kind of a search also. There'll be rights. You will have to pay a certain amount. All of those things will come. So as middle class, it's not in our interest to do this. But as students of literature, as students of, as people who are interested in stories of other lives, what is our excuse for not documenting these, right? Because people theorize this. People theorize this from, from the kinds of movements of domestic workers that happens everywhere, right? People theorize this from the perspective of, oppression and all of that in a certain way. But if you really have these stories, we are theorizing this in terms of not experiences, but in according to our dogma, according to our interest. This is how it would work. But it might be very different. So when you read Burnett's edited versions, you understand that, all right, they think very differently. For example, you go to Adivasi areas, and Adivasis, you might think there is there are these cows and all outside. So, it's the kind of cow shed, and you get in, and it's not your everyday scene of like, a well presented middle class food, but you actually understand how completely respectful, completely mindful of hygiene aspects these people are, right? Because you need to be very, very, like, and they won't eat at other places, but because they think people are like us aren't clean enough. They don't. There's a lot of, and we have hygiene issues because when they read plastic and all of that, you talk to them, you understand it's a very different story. For example, in Delhi, most of the work of collecting garbage from houses is with a community called scavenger community, and the community has a remarkable sense of order because you have to organize the waste of so many households. So they're very underpaid. They're very sort of uh, they'll be fired anytime. There is no surety for many of these things. It's all true. At the same time, there is a big lesson which can be transformative in our understanding of how do we organize things in them. right? So what I'm saying is that we don't listen to these stories because we might have to change our stories. We might have to actually correct ourselves. We don't want to do that, right? Because we can always afford to make them invisible, make them silent, make them absent. But we do need their work, right? We do need their work, but at the same time, we can do this. So what I'm saying is that we have, when we talk about these kinds of stories, and I want to say this to students who are also listening, there are so many stories that need to be documented and put together. And when you put that together, you might have a very different world. I mean, like, people who belong to subaltern communities, be that women, be that African Americans, Dalits, gay, trans, lesbian, transsexual community, all of them, one thing they do is write autobiographies. Why do they write autobiographies? They write autobiographies because you're he, you're she, you're you, you're I. These things don't have they've been abstracted from the available narratives, without the experience of some kind of lives from the margins. So you've created an I, a you, a he, a she, that is empty of the experience of people outside us. So one of the things that you could and you should, we should do is, not you, we should all do, is to actually gather these, because there's an educational capacity, a socio-technical capacity, which is not lacking because they don't want to do it. It's not given to them because there's a lot of exploitation, because in the socioeconomic order, the educational system, all of it is actually is reproducing a social order. That's the job, right? When you're doing that, one of the ways in which you can break it is by bringing in stories, bringing in narratives from these margins, which would actually change the whole perspective. Right, our sense of aesthetics would change, our sense of ethics would change, our sense of politics would change, our sense of ourselves would change. Right, once that sort of a work comes up, right, then we will be talking about a different region, a different country, a different people. Yeah, and one of the things that new historicism has allowed us to do, literary theory has allowed us to do, is to read against the gray, is to read for silences, read for black holes, read for aporias, and see how a narrative might be talking against itself, how a narrative is about certain inabilities, just like about possibilities. Right? So we do know how to look for domestic workers across texts now, and we can see how their personality history can be retrieved and created. So it's a critique and also a counter tradition that we will have to work in literature, in movies, in plays, everywhere. Look for these characters, so you get a certain kind of story, right? And you get a different story. But all these texts were not written by domestic servants, so domestic help. So you don't really know. We only know how we created this entity in our language and how we saturated the space with our notions. Right? It's like women in Shakespeare's time, right? They were written by men, they were enacted by men, they were clearly talking about how women are different from men because men were acting as women, so the differentiation had to be there. So Shakespeare put in a lot of things to say such a he, such a she. Then the viewership largely was creating this binary, and because of that, it is all it's an off by for men kind of a thing. But then it becomes a way of saying this is how women are. This is how look at Lady Macbeth, that's how women are. Look at Desdemona, that's how women are. There is a certain stereotyping that happens. Exactly the same with domestic servants. We have created this figure of the domestic help in a certain way. And we need to actually study this using today's ethics and go and take our public ethics, our language into the space of domesticity and explore it. And then we will create a counter culture. We will be able to, we shouldn't be dismissing the text because we're dismissing the past. Past is a necessity. So the idea is to work with it and then create a counter narrative from the available material, but that is only one part of the job. The other job clearly is on the other side is to start gathering material, collecting things, putting them together, and then see how we can escape. I mean, I'm not saying this is something that we need to do because we feel bad for them. No. Because our knowledge, our ethics, our aesthetics are hugely limited because we have been mindless, we have been invisibilizing, we have been sidelining, we have been, pushing things under the carpet. We need to be honest. We need to come up. We need to be holistic. We need an objective understanding of reality to work with it. So, because we're doing that, in order to do that, you need a way of reading the available tradition and putting it against itself, or reading it, creating a concept about it, and gather materials from talking to people right around, because all of us are working with domestic helps. So we talk to them, we collect those stories, we put them together. If 10 people do that, put them together, figure out how is the world seen from their side, what are the stories, right? And some of the stories might just disappear, right? Whose mother went like that in your in areas, so we do need a kind of storytelling from their perspective. They can tell you, you can write that down, they can write that down, we can collect it, and if we do both these things, we might have a very different world to work with. We might have a different set of questions, right? The task is not to find new solutions for old questions, because wrong questions will only have wrong answers. And the task is to recognize new questions, new problems. And then for that, we do need these stories, because we have a huge hole in our attempt to understand ourselves. Yeah. So I think this is in life narratives, people are talking about, lunatic asylums, thanks to Foucault, prisons, medicine, psychiatry, different kinds of sexualities, different kinds of, experiences. In all of this, there is that entity which is right there, which we somehow have been missing in a big way. I mean, there have been some books that have come up. There have been some studies in economics. There have been some studies in by the NGOs and political parties, but somewhere, like, let's just ask ourselves. I mean, I'm guilty of this. I don't know how many of you would feel so. Uh, uh, we create a certain kind of narrative which somehow doesn't engage with this every day of our lives, because it's just it's a labor that's cheaply available, a person who can just be dismissed at any point. It's the worst we talk about contractualization in academics, contractualization in blue collar jobs and all. This is the worst kind of contractualization, because you don't have to ask anyone. Don't come from tomorrow is good enough, right? They work for they're there for 10 years. There is nothing, there is no question asked, right? By anybody. There is not even a mechanism. It's like people who are brought up in orphanages and foster homes for the Indian state. There is no reservation for them. Nobody asks any questions about that. The same thing, do we have service conditions for people who are working at home? No. I mean, some states tried, like, minimum wages to be applied and all of that. I mean, none of which will work. We know, because the great Indian middle class knows how to get around these things, because it's a system, it's a legal system that's devised for our wealth and the protection of our wealth and the reproduction of our world order in the same way, which is why it doesn't work. So we do need to get out of this in reading. Look for them when you watch a movie, when you're watching reading a play. Look for the for the main characters. I mean, one big novel, the French Lieutenant's woman, which is about a domestic servant and all of that. And this is set in John Fowles. It's set in Victorian time. And so when I was reading it, He hadn't done any research. Interesting. It's a very good novel. It's a very interesting novel in very many ways. But if you look at the mechanical, the technical, the everyday aspect of a person's work in terms of how much time did they get, how much free time did they get, how much money were they paid, and all of that, John Fawcett got it all wrong, because it was about a character. It was not about that historical entity. He's writing a historical novel, by the way. So there is a certain way in which, when we look at these things, how much are they paid, what are the terms of conditions, how are they treated, and all of that, because it's not about what you want to do for domestic maids. Of course, we all love them a lot, most of us, but it is important how holistic, how complete, how honest, how ethical a picture we have of ourselves. So we do need to get into these uncomfortable zones. We need to get out of our comfort zones and go into this. And we need to have that kind of empathy, which is not just to relate with them and feel good about what we're doing. No, because it has the revisionary potential of redefining ourselves. So that's a story that we need to read those things. There aren't too many. There's no point in just taking one book and then going over. It's a wonderful book, and you just that doesn't work, right? We do need a reading practice, and we need an archival practice which provides us newer readings and newer revisionary engagements with this kind of thing. So that's when our life story is bound with these people whose labor is invisibilized and who become a certain kind of fertilizer to our lives. So we need to understand what went into it and engage with it. And that will make us more ethical, more humane, and that will revise and redefine our aesthetics and our society at large. That's all that I want to say for now. I hope I haven't taken more time than I should have. Thank you so much for being very patient and this wonderful opportunity. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for addressing the existence of this obvious political problem within the household and the silence of the space of domesticity. I sincerely thank Dr. N.P. Ashley for sharing his extensive repertoire of knowledge and doing full justice to the topic that has always existed as a blind spot and an invisible problem in our society. It was wonderful listening to how you incorporated movies and works of literature that normalized violence and exploitation and caricatured this section of the society. I'm sure our participants are eager to interact with you. So the floor is now open to questions and interaction with our esteemed guest. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. So I'll read one out. This
Yeah.
is by Minakshi Verma. How would you look at the idea of coming forth of all domestic help replacing humans? How do you think it will change the dynamics of all?
AI is the question artificial intelligence, or how do you look at the idea of coming
AI
forth of the
domestic help.
AI, right?
Sorry, sir.
Oh,
Yes,
right,
yes, it
right.
is. There is another part to the question, too, sir. I think, yeah. I would like to know what the speaker feels about it and how does he think it would change the narratives? Artificial intelligence, yes.
Okay. As in, one artificial, I really can't say how artificial intelligence would change. I mean, because a lot of the times, it's like this vaccination thing. When once vaccine came, it's not like everybody's going to get vaccinated and it's all over, right? Because we're talking about 7 billion people. 7 billion people is a lot of people, right? To vaccinate, we have vaccinated 13 million already, and we the first round, the second round, 4.6 million, right? So others are going to, will start later. By the time people of our age group get it, maybe maybe another 6 months or something like that. That's what we are told now. So I'm using this to say there are some people who would do the vaccination, and there are people who would slowly get there, right? And this is true of all AI integration, humanoids, everything. because what will happen in the future is always happening in phases, right? So the Google cars that have come to America, the electricity driven cars, the Teslas, all of that. Now that'll there's a lot of investment in these things, and a lot of times the kind of okay, we need to replace the fuel for fuel energy. That's the whole narrative. Now the problem is it will require a lot of R&D. It'll require a lot of work. Even then, it'll be only for the initial part. It'll only be available to some people, right? So a lot of these things will take a lot of time, right, for it to get to every part. A lot of times like domestic work is not very common in for example in America, in England, really places, because America's, I think, per hour minimum wage is $10, right? So a day you make about what, you employ a person for domestic labor, that'll cost you, suppose 8 hours for 30 days. That'll cost you 18 to 30, 240, yeah, $2,400. That's an awful lot of money, because a software engineer who goes on an L1B visa, usually now, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, their payment was about $3,000, right? $3,000 because they were working from 8 to 5 regularly in the office, and 9 to 12 uh, coordinating with the people here. When people go off to America, we all say, "Oh my God, they're very happy," and all. It's terrible. I mean, I've never seen people work like that. Like 9 to 12 every day they have to work. So they're working 8 hours a regular job, 40 hours a week, and they're doing another 20 hours from home minimum. Sometimes it goes off to another 30 hours and all that. So if you hire an American, you have to pay that kind of money. So what I'm saying is that employing a domestic help is as expensive as employing a software engineer in America. Nobody's going to do that, right? So people would, I mean, how do they manage? They get Mexicans who are illegal migrants, right? Who don't have social security numbers. You don't have to pay them any of these things. You pay them half of this, it'll work, right? And then Donald Trump can come and create a whole hateful politics around them. The fact of the matter is it is actually cost effective, which is why they're bringing all these people, and America is rich because of the way it exists. Or the whole Europe also has the story. Like a lot of people come in because it's cheaper labor, right? And the whole Middle East is built up like that. So what I'm saying is that because of that, if you are law abiding and all of that, you won't have a maid, a domestic help already, because you've automated a lot of things. You have a dishwasher, you have a washing machine, you have a lot of things. And this is going to create a huge problem, because we have economic growth without jobs, which we've seen, right? So then what will happen? So before going into AI and what it would do, of course, once you have AI and all of that, you would be doing a lot of things. For example, forget AI. You have Swiggy and Zomato is also changing the dynamics in a big way, right? Like, earlier you had to cook. A woman of the house has to be worried about who will come in at night. Now it's not a problem. Right, and that's what Corona did, because the kind of freedom that people got over a period of time, that just completely during the lockdown, it was not available, right? That you had to be at home and you had to be doing what you traditionally did, and in places where a very feudal idea is still prevalent, which is prevalent other than in Indian metropolitan cities, everywhere it's very prevalent. So even in Indian metropolitan cities, there are many areas where it's prevalent. So my thing is, I'm sorry, I'm going around a little bit. AI has come in through mechanization already, and even if AI comes, it's not going to be a complete switch over. It is going to take a lot of time to figure it out, and then if that happens, there is going to be a lot of people who are without jobs, which are going to create a different kind of problem, different set of problems, right? Construction field has had that problem. A lot of times, you're trying to mechanize to not give people jobs, but you continue to get that kind of pay. In a spending economy, we're all paid more than we should be because we will spend it. Now we will then start traveling around. Now we can't do that because of Corona. That ways in which economic cycles will be established, where there will be other jobs, right? For example, you would find people in the malls, but and it'll be they'll provide you with certain things. Now, but there is an agricultural laborer who's actually making things for that mall, right? Or there is there's a young child somewhere sitting in Bangladesh whose labor is subsidizing my clothes, or some Brazilian kid and or a woman is actually making the shoe or the chocolate for me, which is hugely, exploitative in a certain way. So labor will become cheap, things will become cheaper, and because there is that kind of survival instinct, people will come from if not from there, from elsewhere for a lesser amount, they'll be available. So I mean, you have a problem because we have 7 billion people, right? So it is what futuristic technology would do cannot be final, because that would create new social problems, new problems for new humanitarian crisis. So one will have to engage with that at some point. Yeah, that's my sense.
Thank you,
I don't
sir.
know if I answered that question, sorry if I haven't.
So there's another question by a
Yeah.
student,
Yeah.
Zachariah.
Mhm.
What do you think are the obstacles that prevent us from coming out of our own boxes and take up the issues of the marginalized? How can we become more holistic?
I think, see, we are all,
Sir, I'm
we,
sorry. Sir,
yeah.
I would like to combine that question with another question by Trisha. She says, we are actually giving a lot of job opportunities to the domestic workers. So by taking this away, do you think we would restrict their freedom further? Thought we could club these two questions together.
Okay, first question is, why are we not coming out of this, this kind of a condition? We all know this, right? It's not like I'm saying anything that we don't already know. We know this, but we are in some sense stuck because we take it for granted first, because we can afford to take it for granted. Because if you say go away, tomorrow there's no job, nobody's going to come and do something. And we don't see, like, that's what I'm saying, how badly do we treat our women. One good example is how less we pay for domestic work. That's my reading, right? Because we think it's okay, it's available for this much money, right? Whatever you're doing, whatever the mother is doing, whatever the wife is doing, it's actually available for this. So it's a very male understanding of economy, saying you go to the office and work. That's very important, but not the work at home, which is like, you try doing it, it's an impossible task. It's the whole Sisyphus story. You're doing this all the time, again and again and again, right? But there's no understanding, there's no sensitivity. The problem is, it's a matter of our affordability, our privilege, that we can do this. So, and second thing is, even when we want to do it, we are also caught by a lot of things. Not because we have terrible political ideologies. We're not. Not everyone thinks I'm rich and I'm powerful and I'm very happy and I'm born to be ruled and all of that. I'm born to rule and not to be ruled. And that's not how everyone thinks about the world. Because we're weak people. We would like some comfort. We would like not to think about what is going into the making of it. Right? That's our thing, right? For example, students will be able to bear me out. You order for a pizza and you're sitting around. You're basically spending time with your friends. You're actually praying to God that the pizza deliverer is late so that you can get the free pizza. Right, we have done that. So there's a certain, I mean, myself, right, because that at a certain point it feels like a nice thing, but it's not, because if that pizza will be paid for by this poor delivery boy, right, then how is this ethical? So there is a whole set of things, like, for example, our fun, our idea of, because we're governed by desires and ideas of coolness and all of that, not so much by, like, ideas of kindness. I'm not saying that's always the case. I've seen this remarkable student generation, for example. I find a remarkable sort of sense of ethics in the student generation now, because it's a new generation actually coming up. So they're thinking about this, but at the same time, the whole setup is such that you don't know how to work it out, right? Because it's not just like, okay, let's do this in this way. You'll have to fight with your father or your mother, your uncles and aunts on a daily basis if you want to take this up, right? Which is unpleasant, right? Which you don't want to do, right? So then it just lets that system be. So we need to really, in order to come out of this, I'm not saying let's do big things. Like I said, let's, as readers, I'm like not activists, as readers, let's read for these lives. As people who listen to stories and as people who can write and read, let's collect these and put them together. So then that's a beginning. That's a beginning at the level of consciousness, at the level of thinking about it. Then slowly that will happen, right? For example, Rohit Vemula, we speak about. Rohit Vemula's mother was adopted, but she was basically a domestic maid, uh, working as a domestic maid in that house. Obviously, child labor. But if you've read his writings, his poems and his note, and my birth was a fatal accident, right? I wanted to be Carl Sagan kind of right, but all I get right is this, right? And you understand that, nothing has been, he doesn't say I have had a terrible life and this is a sad thing. These people are responsible for my being. He doesn't say anything. He just makes an ethical point. He's asking, why is this world so wrong, so bad? Right? That's why it resonated with campuses across the country. Right? It actually inaugurated what I would call the third wave of student movement in the country. First was in the 1920s, 1960s, the 1920s against the British, 1960s against Indira Gandhi, and now in 2010s and 20s in a very new way. There's a very interesting thing that's going on here. So what I'm saying is that when you read this, you understand. When you read, you read the lives of, say, Toni Morrison. She's not saying, oh, she's talking about African American experience. No, she's actually changing our idea about language, our idea about experience, right? So once you're sensitive to that, it starts changing. Now the point is, I'm not saying we should dismiss all domestic maids, and that's a way of dealing with this. Not really at all, right? This is like saying we are maybe sexist and casteist and racist and political correctness demands us that we don't say this, so we don't say it, but we continue to be sexist, racist, and casteist. That's not okay, right? Sanitizing our language is not the solution for this. Engaging with this, right? Because yes, you should have domestic maids, but you shouldn't be saying how much money should I be paid. What is the minimum wage that a person should have? How are they going to educate their children? How are their treatment going to be paid for? How is this that they are going to, how will you make sure that they don't work for more than 8 hours? How will you make sure that they get a weekday off? How will you make sure that they have a good medical facility? They have food might be okay, but nutrition is not okay across the country, right? We always talk about food security. I'm saying nutrition, right? People are undernourished. That's the problem, not so much poverty, right? Undernourishment is a problem. Then they can send their children to quality schools, not for literacy, quality schools, so that they can get that learning, they can get that opportunity that you and I have, right? If we get to go to fancy schools and colleges, and they never do, right? It is a matter of systemic oppression, exploitation, and exclusion. And we need to be inclusive. Like I said, we need all kinds of experiences. One quick thing I want to say is that a lot of things that we're saying now sounds like our common sense. The common sense of humanities and social science departments was built in the 1960s in American and European universities thanks to women going to colleges. Till then, it was only men. Women in huge numbers in a political understanding. African Americans, Jews after the Holocaust, migrants. They went in, they started challenging the common sense of the entire academia. They changed it, right? A person who went to a lunatic asylum became a professor. Then he said, how are you creating, madness across your sanity? Foucault's book comes from that, right? A refugee boy, a Jew refugee boy, Derrida, comes into academics. He changes the thinking, right? A station clerk's lower class son goes to Cambridge and he says, listen, your idea of rural lower class people is all completely your fantasy of being in a city and being middle class. It is not our lives, right? Raymond Williams is that story. Right? And you look at all of them brought in new experiences. So then knowledge changed, not knowledge dissemination, knowledge production changed, right? It doesn't happen in India because we might deal with all of this, but the middle class, the urban will talk about these poor people, Maybe we'll do PhDs abroad, but it's us who are doing the PhDs abroad. You see 10 of the domestic mates, children going to Cambridge or Harvard doing their PhD, you will have a very different idea of knowledge completely. I don't even know what that is, but that'll happen, right? So I'm saying that, it is, we are like, people say it's a spending economy, so you need to spend. We can't spend now, but why don't we actually give it, right? Because it's not our right to get these big fat salaries, all of us, right? There is a certain kind of, because we are like, we think political criticism is criticism of governments, not of the political, of the dominant classes and dominant groups that actually make the social order possible. Indian state is far ahead of Indian people. An Indian state banned dowry when, and what about dowry when now, right? Casteism, anything. But we are not able to, we don't have to think about what will the government do, what are we doing in our little spaces, and how are we going to politicize. I'm not saying charity, I'm not saying be nice and kind, I'm saying how do we work with the same. I'm sorry, am I overshooting the time? Sorry about that. Yeah, yes, Professor Chitra.
Thank you, sir. There are a lot more questions coming in the chat box, but due to time constraint, we need to wind up this Q&A session. I welcome Ms. Alna Marie Isaac, Faculty Department of English, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Chitra. Sir, like you have got me into a plethora of thoughts, but primarily I feel guilty for probably the feudal lord that my great grandfather could be, and the descendants who never understood or who probably would have mindlessly silenced this aspect of domestic labor. Uh, Thanks a lot for making us think. Thanks a lot for bringing this perspective into this conference, making this a meaningful discourse, and for making us students think. I don't know, I think I'm in short of words to thank you, sir, for this. Thanks a lot. I hope that we would be more mindful. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one quick thing. I do see a question there, and Chitra said there are other questions. Please share my email with them.
Sure.
If they write to me, I'll be happy to.
I will definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot
Thank you
for
so
this
much.
session. I would also like to thank the management for giving us an opportunity to organize this conference. To all the heads of the deans, heads of the departments, faculty members who have joined in, all the research scholars, delegates across the country who has joined in, and my dear students. Thank you for being here, for making this discourse meaningful. Thanks a lot. Let us be more mindful and ethical and honest. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We've reached the culmination of the first plenary session scheduled today. I request all to partake in the second plenary session by Dr. Srinathan Muralidharan K.
Professor Chitra, I'll be posting the email ID. Sir, can I post your email ID in the chat
Yeah,
box?
please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, ma'am, please continue.
So the second session will begin by 10:45. Thank you all for participating, and thank you, Dr. N.P. Ashley.